Greetings, everyone. I am Amalia Dache, and I am an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education in the Higher Education Division at the University of Pennsylvania. I have been an assistant professor for the last 6 years, and I actually started my career as a tenured faculty member at the University of Missouri, what's sometimes called Mizzou. Today, I'm going to be talking about my background, my heritage, and the role it plays in the research that I do on racial justice activism, on resistance, broadly speaking, in my work, in my research, and in my teaching. There's a couple of different articles or manuscripts that I want to focus on while I talk about this work that I want to draw from. And I won't be reading excerpts from these pieces, but just to give you an idea, if you want references as far as what encapsulates the work that I'm doing. The main one, the name of it is called Teaching a Transnational Ethic of Black Lives Matter, an Afro-Cubana's Theory of Calle, and that's in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and that was published in 2019. The other piece is an actual book that I was a lead editor on. It's called Rise Up Activism as Education, and that was published in Michigan State University Press in 2019. So these two pieces that just were published last year have been really instrumental in highlighting and focusing on my own personal journey within the work that I do. Again, when the topic of this narrative, of this scholarly narrative, is racial justice work. Doing work that's really anchored on challenging how marginalized communities have been oppressed and subjugated. And so I tend to really focus on the work from transnational and post-colonial perspectives. And of course, I also have a geographic perspective. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I've termed particular constructs such as post-colonial geographic epistemologies and spatial racial factors in college access, particularly in urban communities. I have my notes I'll be drawing from. And I want to talk about my background and the history of Cuba as far as racial resistance, because I think as scholars, we don't get a chance most of the time, especially in the social sciences, to really tell our own narrative and really discuss how our narratives contribute to our research in higher education or in education broadly. And for me, these two last manuscripts, I've been publishing since 2014, 2015. And most of my early research was really specific to evidence-based data, to public data, to data that I collected within research studies. And very little had to do with my own positionality, even though that was, in our dissertation, when you're doing qualitative dissertations, my dissertation was a mixed method dissertation. There is a positionality statement there that I don't know necessarily gets given any light or given any breath in our research as we continue to build a research agenda. So today I get to really talk about my background and focus on this history of Cuba, the history of Cuban resistance in my role and in who I am, and how that contributes to the work that I've done. So you're probably like, okay, well, I'm not familiar with Amalia's work. My most recent work is specific to the Ferguson activism movement. And that happened between 2014 and 2016 in Ferguson, Missouri, in St. Louis. And I did a 2-year project studying activism after I was involved in some activism in Missouri and involved in some of the actions that took place after Michael Brown was killed. So I graduated with my PhD at University of Rochester. I took a faculty position at the University of Missouri. And, I arrived to Columbia, Missouri 4 weeks before Michael Brown gets shot and killed by a Ferguson Police Department officer. And that really catapulted me into doing specifically activist-oriented research in St. Louis. And what I found in this study was that it was, this activism was tied to, of course, racial justice, but it was also tied to issues of class inequality. So in St. Louis and Ferguson, Black populations that were urbanized in St. Louis were working class. So the working class identity of Ferguson activists were very, very, very central. And if you were to look at my research studies that came out of Ferguson, you'll see that there's both a class and race focus. And those were really strong findings, and how the activist movement challenged capital accumulation in the heart of St. Louis, and how the Ferguson suburb was part of, the failures of urban renewal in St. Louis in the heels of, after World War II. So these histories of the failures of urban renewal, the failures of public housing, contribute to the forms of oppression that Ferguson community members, particularly Black working class people in St. Louis, were highlighting and were challenging in reference to the killing of Michael Brown. So all that work that was related to St. Louis and to the Black working class resistance activism in St. Louis contributed to the role that college students played in the movement. So when you looked at the news media, there was assumptions that the Ferguson activist movement was just only a community movement. And so what I found and my collaborator found was that there were college students involved. In our research study, 40% of the participants were college students. And they were enrolled at the time that they were activists, or they had just gotten accepted into college, but they were on college campuses within St. Louis and within the state of Missouri. And so what happened, they were involved in the activism on Ferguson streets, and they brought this activism into the college campus, right? So Ferguson radicalizes these college students to bring equity mindedness and bring challenging domination in the community setting into the college setting. So what happens on the heels of Ferguson is what some of you may know about is the Concerned Student 1950 movement, which took place in the fall of 2015. So a year after Michael Brown gets shot and killed in Ferguson, college students, particularly Black college students who were involved in these movements and radicalized from these movements, spread to college campuses across the state of Missouri. And in particular, the Mizzou campus. And it first started in St. Louis with the Occupy SLU movement. And that was in the fall of 2014, a couple months after Michael Brown gets killed. It was SLU, Occupy SLU's movement, which started from the Ferguson activism movement. And then it extended into the Columbia campus of the University of Missouri in the fall of 2015 through the Concerned Student 1950 movement. And if you're not familiar with the Concerned Student 1950 movement, the book that I mentioned that I was a lead editor on is Rise of Activism as Education. That book centers 4 of the 11 students, their educational journeys and experiences within activism. And it's doing kind of what I'm doing here, right? Giving historical context, giving social context, giving family background to their activism. And then if you're not familiar with the Concerned Student 1950 movement, Google it. You'll also find that there's a documentary called Two Fists Up that was directed by Spike Lee. And he actually came to our campus when he found out that these 11 students were successful in meeting and having the university system meet their demands. And what was one of their major demands? The removal of the system president, Tim Wolf. And that was a historic movement for these 11 students because institutional racism, of course, we know is present in all college campuses in the United States of America. We know that's part of our colonial history. However, no student movement has ever been able to get rid of a college president that was biased, that was negligent in not handling student complaints and not taking students seriously when it came to the racial injustice that they were facing on their campuses. So a couple of events that happened in Ferguson were specific to, for example, the student body president of the University of Missouri was called the N-word when he was walking down the street in Columbia. And that got a lot of attention because obviously this shouldn't be happening in 2015. Next, there was a swastika sign that was found in a college dorm on Mizzou's campus. And then there was other incidents that were a cause for concern for Black students on campus. And that was also tied to just broadly the lack of representation on campus by Black faculty, by Black students at the University of Missouri. And so this historical component of the University of Missouri being in a state that was a former slave state, we have to remember that this is where Dred Scott, the decision for Dred Scott was decided in St. Louis, that a slave was not human, right? A slave was a slave. And so they couldn't have rights as other humans, as other white humans in the United States during that time period. So these students, Concerned Student 1950, they bring all of this history, all this context into their activism. And one student in particular starts a hunger strike, and 8 of the students are Black women on campus who are doing so much, who are predominantly undergraduates. So the 11 students were a combination of undergraduate students and graduate students. And again, there were predominantly women who were leading this. So the Two Fists Up film is something that you should definitely take a look at, as far as if you want to know about what happened in the University of Missouri and how this movement was the catalyst for 70 college campus movements on racial justice in the fall of 2015 happened and were anchored in what happened at the University of Missouri. I'm right now working on a publication to talk about this component of how this expanded radical racial consciousness in the Black struggle was the catalyst for these 70 movements across the state, across the country in the fall of 2015. And so again, this is just giving you context to my research in case you're not familiar with it. And of course, again, giving you some resources to look up if this really interests you. But what I really want to focus the rest of this scholarly narrative on is my Cuban upbringing and its relationship to why I was so committed when I got to Missouri to do racial justice work in Ferguson. What were the strings that pulled me to be on campus? Because we know, here I am, I'm a junior faculty member. I just arrived to Missouri. I'm on a tenure track. And so many of you who are on the tenure track and many of you who are in the academy know that if you do activist-oriented work, that's not necessarily going to get rewarded. And most of the time, you're dissuaded into not doing that type of work. It may count against you. You know, there may be a stigma attached to you as a scholar to do that work. So I never thought not to do the work, right? So that was just never a part of my rationale as to my purpose as a researcher and as a scholar. I've always been very aligned with my calling in life, which is to really do the most good for the most of us. For me right now, doing work that focuses on race, ethnicity, and class within urban environments is really key. Looking at the material conditions of people's lives, people's access to food, to shelter, to housing, and its contributions to their upward mobility in life in the democratic society. And again, looking at communist socialist states like Cuba is also a part of my future work and what I'm working on now. But that all comes from roots. You know, how am I rooted? Why was I so consistent and so steadfast in doing the Ferguson work, being so early in junior in my career? You know, why wasn't I shook? Why wasn't I afraid, right? Being unafraid comes from my background, comes from my family background, comes from the history of my native country. I was born in Havana, Cuba in the late 1970s. And Cuba, if you're not familiar with the Cuban context, you know, Cuba has a strong history of resistance, very strong history of resistance. And it starts with looking at their colonial period. And again, because my work is post-colonial, looking at Cuba's colonial period and looking at their independence from Spain in 1901 shaped my family and my own thinking about how I've resisted, how my ancestors have resisted. So when you think about the Spanish independence and Cuban independence in 1901, that was a part of a movement, quote unquote, of Afro-Cubans. So Afro-Cuban slaves and white Cubans, which they called criollos, which were the sons of the Spaniards that lived and were born in Cuba, the colony of Cuba, when these two groups came together to free themselves from the motherland, from Spain. So to become their own country, to become their own republic. So it started with this combination of bringing these two groups together. So Latin American history and Caribbean history, in particular, the Hispanophone Caribbean, you have these ideas called racial democracy, which in Latin America and the Caribbean really is this idea of egalitarianism and equality across racial lines. And so but one of the salient reasons that you have these myths of racial democracy much more present in Latin America and in the Caribbean, right? These ideas that racism was eradicated or there was less racism in Latin America and the Caribbean because of the racial mixing, right? So when you think of Latin America and you think of the Caribbean, especially Hispanophone Caribbean, you always get this idea of mixing, right? And then if you look at like just Latino studies and Latin American studies scholarship, you'll see that racial mixing was something that was a policy concern. Like white national governments that were in power wanted to swallow indigenous people and swallow African people and combine them into their white nation and basically whiten, right? So they called it blanquimiento, whiten the society. So because we had in Cuba and in Brazil, we had the largest populations of Africans, and because in other parts of Latin America, the African presence wasn't as salient as it was in Cuba and Brazil, for example, and it was more indigenous, these white colonial governments wanted to make it less black and brown. And so through racial mixing, through policies of miscegnation, right, to ideas of mixing and cultural mixing, of course it wasn't equal. Of course, Blackness was still dehumanized. There was still a component that was salient, which was we're a mixed society. Whereas in comparison to the US, where you had the one drop rule and where there were anti-miscegnation laws and where it was illegal for you to actually mix, even though it happened, and most of it was under rape and duress in Cuba, although rape and duress were present, it wasn't state sanctioned. It wasn't a state policy to not mix. So on that, you have the Cuban Revolution, you have the Cuban independence, not revolution, that's later, that's 1959. So you have Cuban independence that comes on the heels of this thinking of mixing. So you have key players in the Cuban independence movement. And what frees Cuba from Spain is these ideas of Afro-Cubans being a part of the nation. You have these ideas of Afro-Cubans and mulatto Cubans, which are mixed Cubans. And again, in Cuba, because there's not a one-drop rule, you have a lot of different variations of Blackness. So you have white on top, blancos, and you have negros at the bottom. And in the middle, you have mulattos. You have various shades of mulattos. You have various shades of mulattos to trigueños, trigueños to full white. On the other end, you have moros, which are darker skinned. It looks very much like Brazil. Brazil and Cuba have the same racial hierarchy as far as white and black, but you have in between an internal hierarchy, like a microcosm of the broader hierarchy that also plays a role in why mulatto Cubans get to advance more than negros in Cuba, because they get to whiten. So mulattoes get to whiten if you have particular class dynamics and class factors and class attributes. Even like in the British colonized Caribbean, if you have a class background that's high, it whitens you, right? So that's the case in Cuba, not only through skin type and phenotype, but also it's through class and through money. Where in the US, in the time period of even, post-antebellum period, money doesn't whiten. Nothing gets to whiten a Black family. People can argue now that may be a little bit more of the case. Sometimes they use cases like O.J. Simpson and like Barack Obama because of their class dynamic got to be whitened. But there's debates about that. But ultimately in Cuba, you could. So what I want to focus on is this idea of racial democracy, the idea that the Cuban independence movement was led by two mulattoes and a white Cuban, Jose Marti, Maximo Gomez, who was a mulatto Dominican, and you had Antonio Maceo, who was a mulatto Cuban. You had basically two Afro-Latin, one Afro-Cuban, one Afro-Dominican, and a white Cuban being the face of independence. So in the US, we can't really fathom that. Imagine having the American Revolution being led by two former slaves and a white American. That would change the history of this country, just the representation on itself. So we have that kind of multicultural leadership in the consciousness of Cubans, both Black and white and mulatto and mixed Cubans, that the Cuban nation was born out of this racial mixing of leadership in battle, right? Although Antonio Maceo and Maximo Gomez on the Black side, they were seen as the brawn, right? As the actual physical helped in battle to beat the Spanish. And Jose Marti was seen as the academic, the brains, right? So it still like follows this idea of the colonial binary, and it still falls into this racial hierarchy. Yet during that time period, it is unheard of in a society that was colonial to have independence come through this multicultural form of leadership. So knowing that Afro-Cuban presence in the leadership of Cuban independence contributes to the way Cubans think. during the Republic, right? So during the Republic is the time period from between 1901 and 1959 before the revolution. During that period, you have basically like the Harlem Renaissance of Cuba. You have this Afro-Cubanismo, or some people call it just Cubanismo, which means you have the African presence being highlighted in Cuba. And that came off the heels of a lot of activism, a lot of Afro-Cuban activism. Once Cuba becomes a free state, a free society, independent society, the US comes in and attempts to put in place Jim Crow type policies and laws into the Cuban consciousness of its white Cuban leaders. But you also have a very strong Black movement happening in 1912 called El Partido Independiente de Color, the Of Color Party. And it was like one of the first kind of Black political parties in the Caribbean and all Latin America in 1912. Well, between 1908 and 1912. In 1912, there was a massacre, a white supremacist massacre that some of the literature says the US had a lot to do with this massacre that happened in Cuba and killed about 5,000 Afro-Cubans who were fighting for continual racial justice to happen in Cuba, even though, again, all of these ideas of racial democracy were shaping the nation between 1901 and 1912. You still have basically this white supremacist massacre that's happening in 1912. To give context, in 1912, Cuba doesn't have Jim Crow like the US, right? So Cuba doesn't have institutionalized legal policies of segregation. What it does have is US influences of white supremacy battling, these ideas of racial democracy coming from Afro-Cubans and mulatto Cubans and Cubans of color who led the nation into the independence and freeing of Spain. All right, 1912 happens. There's a huge movement between 1920 and 1940 called Cubanismo, meaning that the nation and its white elite starts addressing, because it's being pushed by Black Cubans, that Black Cubans are critical to the nation. So music, entertainment, African cultural values, because African religions, Afro-Cuban religions, and the syncretism of Catholicism and religion and Bantu and Yoruba religions is central to Cuban identity. So this Afro mixing within the Cuban nation, so across racial lines, you have Cubans practicing the syncretism of Catholicism, Yoruba, and Bantu traditions. So this is a part of the nation for 20 years. And then you have political movements that are trying to create affirmative action in the Cuban state. Fast forward to 1959. And I'm skipping a lot because I don't have a lot of time. And I want to also talk about my own upbringing. And I'm giving you a whole history of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban independence movement. As I talked about Ferguson and St. Louis, I didn't even get a chance to talk about Rochester, but I'll do that in a minute. So I say this to say that in 1959, when Fidel Castro comes into power, there's this conception in the West and this conception of the revolution, right? The fact that it's called the Cuban Revolution, that before the revolution, everything was bad, that Afro-Cubans were being, racially discriminated institutionally, which was the case to a certain extent, and that imperialism and the US played a huge role in the oppression of Cuba, which again, not discrediting that wasn't the case to a certain extent. But there are a lot of debates, especially now with the literature on race and racial resistance in Cuba and in its history and how it's been erased post-1959 in order to prop up Fidel Castro's government and the revolution, right? So a lot of my experience came from the fact that I was a refugee from the Cuban Revolution. So my father was a political prisoner in Fidel Castro's dictatorship and totalitarian government. And in 1980, the Mariel Exodus, which was the exodus of 125,000 Cubans, fled Cuba to come to the US. And my father in Cuba, prior to 1980, was in prison for over 5 years, on and off, because he did not believe in the Cuban Revolution, which to him and to many Cubans, 125,000 to be specific, in 1980, didn't believe in what Fidel Castro was doing for 20 years. So from 1959 to 1980, Fidel Castro takes the country and puts forward policies like literacy, puts forward policies like free healthcare, and also puts forward policies of indoctrination, also puts forward policies of anti-religion. So if you were religious in Cuba before 1980, well, actually before 1990, you were seen as an enemy of the state. So my mother would go to Catholic church in the 1960s and 70s, and guards, military guards, would throw rocks at my mother because she was going to church. Because in the communist Marxist regime that they were trying to enforce using the Russian model, religion is the opiate of the masses. But for Cubans, religion was also a show of ethnic and racial solidarity, right? Again, because there was this very strong African, Afro-Cuban component, it was a part of Cuban identity. So can you imagine, for generations, Cubans have this Afro-Cuban identity is tied to their religion and spirituality. And then in 1959, because the government says you can't practice your religion anymore, and you can be arrested and you can be harmed and violently attacked for practicing your religion, how that would shake the core of so many people and why it pushed so many people to leave. It wasn't just religion, but religion was a part of it. For my family, my father was a palero, and then later he would be a santero, and my mom was a santera. What does that mean? They were priests of the religion Ifa Orisha, which is tied to Yoruban cultural traditions. And of course, my brothers and I were all initiated in this religion in the early 1990s. And the Mariel boat lift, the fact that we were refugees, the fact that 60,000 Cubans from 1959 to the present, there is a statistic that says about 60,000 Cubans have died between Cuba and Miami in the ocean because they're fleeing from the island and they're facing of oppression. And so a lot of the research that's come out now, in particular, there's a text called a book called The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution by Danielle Pilar Cleland, which is really central in a lot of the work that I'm doing now in Cuba, talking about how racial ideology in the Cuban Revolution, right? How white supremacy in the Cuban Revolution from 1959 till present is contributing to the oppression of Black Cubans and is limiting their access. And so this is always butt up against this idea that Cuba has free education, Cuba has free this, free that. But when you actually go and talk to people, a country that's predominantly of African descent, they're mostly in poverty. It's almost like when I was interviewing Cubans, because I've done a Cuban study, Cubans will say to me, well, what's the sense of having free education if you don't have food? And then some people will say, well, it's because of the embargo. It's not just the embargo. Fidel Castro and his government has made very, very bad calls on domestic policy. So domestic economic policy and domestic policy across the board, right? The fact that they chose to have a non-democratic society that does not have elections. So the fact that they have a totalitarian dictatorship for the last 60 years has zero to do with the embargo of the United States, right? There's a part of it has to do with the embargo, but at the same time, you have countries like Spain that have had businesses in Cuba for a long period of time that help Cuba in their economy. So the hotels in Cuba and tourism, 51% belongs to the state, and then 49% can be owned by another private company, like companies that are controlled by the Spanish. So you still have businesses in Cuba. The state controls all businesses by 51%, but that 49% comes from other outside investments. So we can't always say that it's the embargo. It's not the embargo only. The embargo has a particular role in it, but before 1959, there's also numbers that say that the US controlled all businesses in Cuba. Not the case. Some of the statistics I've heard is 70% of Cuban economy was controlled by the Cubans. So 30% was owned by maybe Americans in Europe, but 70% was Cubans. And so what people forget is that component, that Cubans also played a role in building the nation, and Black Cubans played a role in building the nation. And Blackness and race is something that it's not even allowed to be a part of their identity anymore, because it all falls under being a revolutionary. Being a revolutionary is not raced. Post 59, Fidel said, we don't need racial policies because we have class policies. And if we address class policies and if we apply Marxism, we do not have to address racial issues. So he got rid of all types of organizations similar to like the NAACP in Cuba. All kinds of organizations that were created by Black Cubans along racial lines were banned. So no political parties, no organizations could be organized with a racial lens. Supposedly, Cuban Revolution eradicated racism. That's not the case. Next is how this contributes to my work in Rochester. I come here as a 3-year-old refugee with my family. We come to Miami. We live in refugee camps Because my parents, we were Afro-Cubans in the Mario boat lift that had high concentrations of Cubans of color, we get to Miami, a very white Cuban space, and we don't have family. Although some Miami Cubans did offer us their homes, we didn't have job connections. We didn't have a social network, right? So white Cubans in Miami in the 1980s already had generations of Cubans that were white Cubans that had left Cuba in the 1960s and 70s that were already in Miami building capital, building the economy, that were reaching out to them. But because of racism in Cuba, because racism in Cuba did exist before 59, but in particularly after the wealthy class leaves Cuba, which is predominantly white, not all white, but predominantly white, because there was a Black upper class and there was a Black middle class during the Republic, which was before the revolution. There were Black businesses, there were Black home ownership. It wasn't at high percentages, but some would argue it was higher percentages per capita than other Latin American countries. So actually Cuba before 59, and so the scholarship that I've read did a lot for racial equality, but it was erased during the 60 years of the revolution during Castro. All this to say, it shaped my experiences in my research and how my father was completely anti-revolution, and our home, what we discussed was democracy and equality. And my father really believed in the US democratic system. He believed that in the US, you had freedoms that didn't exist in Cuba, which were true as far as having legal rights. In Cuba, people don't have legal rights, right? You don't have due process. You don't have a right to congregate. You don't have a right to free expression or protest. If you protest, you go to jail. And because you don't have due process, you can go to jail for 20 years. So I have family members and I have cousins who, before the American dollar was legal in Cuba in the late 1990s and early 2000s, were arrested just for having American dollars and were in prison for years just because they carried American dollars. Right. And these are Black Cubans, right? My family is of African descent. So you have the Cuban prisons, have highest concentrations of Afro-Cubans and Black Cubans in the prison systems. And you don't see them represented in the universities. That's what I'm learning from my research studies, that Black Cubans and Afro-Cubans and mulatto Cubans aren't represented highly, right? You may see a sprinkle of them, just like you do in capitalism, but you don't see them in high positions of power. And you don't see them in the high economic brackets. Most of the so-called private businesses in Cuba are owned by white Cubans. So if racism was eradicated for the last 60 years under the revolution, you wouldn't see that racial hierarchies. You wouldn't see it, and you do, and it's present. So how does this contribute to my work in Rochester and St. Louis and now Philadelphia? So now I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been really concentrating on work having to do with public housing. And I submitted grants to do work on public housing and issues of access. Philadelphia has a 25% poverty rate. So 1 in 4 people in Philadelphia is living in poverty. And as far as children, 45% of children in Philadelphia are living in poverty. Philadelphia is considered, out of all the big cities in the United States, as the poorest city in the country. And Philadelphia is also seen as a Black city. Philadelphia has a strong history of resistance. You think about the MOVE bombing that happened in the 1980s. I've taken my course students, I'm now teaching a class on urban geography in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. And we went to the MOVE bombing site. And we realized, I was shocked to learn that this happened in the 1980s. A Black community in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, was bombed in the 1980s by the state. 61 people died in the 1980s. We are exploring that in my research. I've also looked at the Latinx community in North Philly and the history of the Latinx community. And what I've learned is that that community also, urban renewal and planning, contributed to having toxic waste transportation and transport. I think was called Conrail, was a part of this industry in the North. And that the Conrail system was where you had a lot of drug activity. And so you have toxic waste areas in Latinx areas that contribute to high crime and that contribute to educational resources being depleted from those communities and employment being depleted in those communities. There's organizations and community centers that are fighting back against that and trying to build housing and trying to stop gentrification from happening for the Latinx community in North Philly. And that community is called the Centro de Oro. So those are areas that I'm exploring now in Philadelphia through my courses. So for example, I teach a course on urban geography and critical higher education, looking at issues of access for local communities of color in urban areas. And I don't always have to do work on urban areas. My work has always been specific to urban areas because the urbanization of the United States has really been a result of racial segregation. Urban renewal, urban policies have been results and have been mechanisms and tools of segregation post Jim Crow. And because of that, I feel as if those areas are in high need of inquiry, education inquiry, and issues of access because it's tied to segregation, but it's also mechanized differently now that we're not in it's not de jure segregation, even though some would argue that, like Rothstein and the Color of Law would argue that we still are in de jure segregation mode, but some would argue that we're in de facto segregation. And so how these kind of invisible ways of segregating societies are built into urban areas. But rural communities face similar types of forms of oppression, especially when you think about access, right? That they don't have transportation like urban communities do, that they have less capital, right? So looking at how wealth inequality has affected communities that are working class across racial lines is a really, really specific spatial factor that I'm interested in probably looking at in the future. But for now, as you've learned, my past, my heritage as a Cuban, and particularly as an Afro-Cuban, has contributed to the work that I do and have done, right? To my work in Ferguson, to the Latinx work I did with Latinx students in the city of Rochester with my former advisor, Judy Marquez Kiama, and to the work I'm doing now in Cuba. And so my work moving forward is really looking at, Afro-Latin American political thought and its contribution to racial ideologies and challenging racial ideologies within the US, looking at a capitalist system, and then also looking at how these racial ideologies and political ideologies have worked together to build the nation in Cuba. Those are my areas of research, and I know that this is going to have a huge contribution in higher education and ethnic studies work, and then broadly in looking at political economy, works in political economy and geography. So although racial justice activism isn't necessarily something that's looked at as far as this protest, like my work in Ferguson, activism and resistance in particular is tied to post-colonial studies, right? Looking at the subaltern. And it's tied to how political economies function, right? How there's moral economies of justice and moral economies of injustice, which I learned about those theories and terms and looking at Cuban resistance and how they tried to equalize racial problems in Cuba through policy and typically through economic policy during the Republic period. So, I hope that you enjoyed learning about the intersection of transnationalism, post-colonial studies, and access in my own background and in the work that I do. And I look forward to having you look more into the research and into the studies that I've mentioned here today. Gracias y adelante.